Welcome to CAM Radio, an Ahead of the Curve initiative by Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas, bringing you every Friday the latest in legal and policy. Stay tuned. Enjoy listening.
And I'd like to start by introducing our panelists. Nitin Mittal is the General Counsel and Company Secretary at Signify, which was formerly Philips Lighting. Nitin, you're responsible for the entire Greater India and Pacific region. And we know you have more than 21 years of experience. You've worked across industries, worked with MNCs, so that's brought you in touch with cultures for more than just the Asian geographies that you've covered, US, Europe, China. And I know Nitin's range of transactions transcends just M&A. You've been responsible for large restructurings, building teams ground up, setting up contract management, legal training frameworks. Nitin, it's a pleasure to have you in this session. Disha, thank you for joining us. Disha Chhabra is Director of M&A at Coca-Cola in India. She's an engineer, an MBA, and a CFA. Disha, you've been in the industry for more than 15 years. You've worked with many MNCs, Deloitte, HSBC, Bharti Airtel, Pernod Ricard. And as part of your current profile, you are responsible for end-to-end execution of M&A. That includes not just legal issues, valuation, strategic financial assessments. Thank you very much for making it, Disha. We couldn't have thought of a better panel to talk through solutions to the VUCA impacts on M&A. So to get the conversation rolling, I'll start off with just a broad overview of the kind of issues that we are seeing from when we try to do M&A in the VUCA environment. And then Nitin, Disha, and Mr. Shroff, I'll like to bring you in. So at the very least, we're seeing three overarching trends as deal makers. And I think I speak for the broader advisory community, not just for law firms. I think if you spoke with any investment bank, if you spoke with any of the big four, in this wider advisory ecosystem around M&A in all the major jurisdictions of India, I think see the same trend. The first is there's an overarching disinclination for complex structures. If it looks complex, there has to be a very compelling economic reason why the deal team would sign off on that. I think across sectors, there's just going in position as if between two deals, unless the risk-reward ratio on more complex structure is way off the charts, across the board, we're saying nobody has the appetite. I think there's a clear shift. It's no longer a question of whether it's perfectly legal. It doesn't matter if if it's good for all the constituencies involved. We've seen this time and again. If on the slide deck it looks complex, it's too complex. Another trend we are seeing Nitin and Disha, I'd like to bring you in on this as we go along, is offshoring. A number of times, entirely Indian businesses have come to us and said, when it's time for M&A, we'd like to offshore the structure. Just because people don't want to deal with the complexity and uncertainty of enforcement of contracts in India. Usually this flounders for two reasons. Where the capital markets are in India, there's a preference to list in India because the multiples in India are much higher than you can get for the same business in most of the other markets, London, New York. But if it's not IPO ready, or if the entity in question is not going to be the listed entity, and the other sort of bulwark against this is tax. If offshoring is going to be tax inefficient, then that's a reason why people won't offshore. But increasingly, if these two considerations are not there, I think in the last 7 to 8 years, we've got more inquiries for offshoring of Indian structures than we had any time before that. And it's driven entirely by business reluctance to expose contract enforcement to the Indian legal system, expose valuation adjustment structures to Indian regulatory VUCA. And the third sort of overarching trend in transaction creation is pre-consult. I think initially this was the norm only in regulated businesses. So if a regulated business was going to undergo M&A, it would be expected that the entity would consult with its home regulator. So you wouldn't hear of a large bank merger or a large NBFC transaction unless the CGM in charge has been spoken to, because nobody wants the home regulator to read about their transaction in the newspaper. But now, pre-consult is a norm across sectors. Any transaction that doesn't have a tried and tested model, I think our advice, and in fact most of the time the instructions that we get are there has to be a very senior level engagement repeatedly, at least 3 sessions at the senior most level of the regulators with proper presentations being made on the structures. Then we leave it at them so that they can think about it. And then there's a follow-on conversation where they ask us questions, why are you doing this? Is this a way to avoid that? And then the entire structure is then revised. So this degree, it's almost like they are a part of the deal-making team at the structuring stage. This is way beyond anything we've seen. Certainly before 5 years ago, I don't think this was the norm. So I'd say these would be the 3 overarching trends, but there are a couple of individual specific deal-specific trends that are emerging when we try to get M&A done. Because all of them ultimately are driven by this overhang of ambiguity. The first is deferred consideration. For the longest time, this was a plausible way to bridge valuation disconnects. People have different views on what the business will deliver in the future. And since nobody had crystal balls, they'd agree that if the business performs, we'll share part of it with you. And 5 years ago, you could go to the RBI and get a specific approval. We've all done deals where you have 5-year deferred considerations. You have deferred considerations for up to 50%, but today it's just unthinkable. You won't get it. Because the RBI's position is, look, all that discretion is now off the table. You have a hard-bound regime of 18 months, 25% FMV. If your deal can't fit within that, then that's too bad. And I can tell you that the number of M&A inquiries that go up to the term sheet stage and then flounder because parties are not able to bridge the valuation disconnect using a deferred consideration model, I think it's just increased considerably in the last 3 years. Deferred closings for Indian limbs. Actually, now it doesn't matter. Every time there's a global acquisition, the Indian piece almost invariably is put in the last wave. So as Indian counsel joining those calls, sometimes it's embarrassing, sometimes it's amusing. But there'll be closings happening in Brazil, there'll be closings happening in Europe, and then India will be part of the last wave for closing because everyone knows India is complex. We don't know why it is complex, but India is complex. So we'll deal with India at the very end. Insurance. I think 5 years ago, tax insurance because of the Vodafone deal was the only kind of insurance that we would see in the M&A deal in the deal table, but that's no longer the case. We see customized insurance policies to address very specific risks that businesses cannot price in. It's just a completely new phenomenon. It didn't happen in the Indian M&A market 2 years ago. Rep and warranty indemnity insurance is, again, completely new development in the last 5 years. Again, because these risks, these are not the kind of risks that businesses can price in. This is not their core competency. So they'd rather offshore this risk to institutions that can absorb it and just get on with the core activity of, the synergies. Another development that's recurrent is you call out the risk. You put it on the table, you agree that this is the unknown issue here. So if the ability to depreciate goodwill, we don't know it's going to change in the budget or not, bring it up to consciousness, allocate it specifically. You attach a price to that variable. If these variables fructify, this is going to be the adjustment in price. So just that ability to articulate the risks that neither party is willing to assume, or it's explicitly allocated to one side. This is another area where we are seeing increasingly in M&A documentation, lawyers and the Big Four collaborating with clients to try and address the VUCA implications on M&A. And the last in this, before I then turn to the panelists, is just longer long stop dates. It's just a simple point, but it's had, from a drafting perspective, it's just had a knock-on effect. Because when you had a 2-month long stop date, a 3-month long stop date, people really didn't bother about adjusting the purchase price again for net debt, working capital on the date of closing, or for very watertight standstill governance. But frankly, in the last 2 years, most large transactions that we've advised on, the long stop date is a year. Because everyone gets it, everyone understands getting 5 approvals is a year. No regulator wants to sign off on the file till the other regulator has signed off on it. We've had regulators return files to us saying, first let the NCLT order come, then come back to us. So those parallel processing are all matters of the past. So now in this background, Nitin, I'd just like to open it up and maybe turn to you for your general observations. I know I have some specific questions, but before we do that, I'd like to bring you in generally for your take on this.
Thank you, Shishir, and thank you, Mr. Shroff, Akila, for inviting me for this panel. I will give an MNC perspective. I'm from Signify. Signify is the world's largest lighting company, and we are present in more than 70 countries. Now, if you see from an M&A perspective, I think India, as Mr. Shroff also mentioned, it's like a VUCA on steroids. I would also say India is the golden geese right now. And we need to ensure that there's not too much of steroids right now. Otherwise, the life will shorten of the opportunities that are there in India. From an MNC perspective, you see India is part of a global conglomerate that we are. And any M&A which happens globally, there is always talk that India has to be treated specially because there's a lot of unpredictability, there's a lot of uncertainty, especially ensuring that the deal closes on time. So decisions are taken at headquarters. They want to ensure that the deal happens in a certain time frame, in a certain manner. But in certain sense, sometimes when we plan for India, we see that there are certain variables that, unknown unknowns, we don't really know. How do you plan that? And that is the VUCA environment that you're talking about. But I would say from last decade or so, the predictability has improved to a large extent, especially with regulators. SEBI, for example, is one of the regulators. But, for example, the Competition Commission. There are so many regulations coming, every few months there is something new, which also leads to a lot of unpredictability. But also I would say the approach of the regulators to hear the business, because ultimately it's about ease of business. And you want to ensure that India's economy is growing from 3.5 trillion, which is now, and I think the target is 30 trillion by 2047 or something. So you can only grow when ease of business is there. And ease of business can only happen when regulators are open to hear the business. And the rule of law says that business can grow and law can only be should be certain and predictable. And that can only happen when regulators are open for that. And so I would say from the topic perspective that there is still a long way to go. And we also see, especially in our deals also, that I would also say one point is that while people have talked about a lot of other things, labor law is something that needs to be really made progressive. Nobody's looking at it. You see the Industrial Dispute Act, probably a lot of decades earlier, but still there is no progress on that. And people, if you want to make India a manufacturing hub, and M&A is all about manufacturing, developing, you need to create something, and that can only be created when you have manufacturing base. So you have to look at labor laws. The labor codes, I think, are pending for so many years now. Nobody is doing anything about it. That's my take.
I do come back to you on the point you made about regulators, but before I do that, Disha, I'd like to bring you in for general observations on deal trends.
Sure. Thanks, Shishir. First of all, truly humbled to share the panel with you, Mr. Shroff, who is definitely the epitome of knowledge and who has seen it all, how it has evolved and how we have overcome. As I reflect on my journey, corporate journey of last 15 years, which has spanned across investment banking, corporate M&A, and within corporates as well, promoter-driven companies to MNC-driven companies, I have seen a very clear shift among the corporates, how they view M&A, how they approach M&A, and what is their objective that they're seeking out of the M&A. Just to build an example, if I move back 15 years, corporates used to just think, okay, I have to acquire a majority stake in the target and my objective is done. Now, the approach is totally changed. Even if I am acquiring a minority stake and as long as my strategic objective is being met, the corporates are okay. And that's how the structures have evolved. This whole notion of VUCA, and interestingly, it goes back to the times of military vocabulary, right? And it still remains relevant in our business context. I believe it's good in a way because it's keeping all the corporates on its toes. And it's a good wake-up call that, every time we have to innovate. And as I see, corporates have had to innovate. And it's not new. It goes back to the time of when Jio entered the telecom industry and I was with Airtel. And fortunate enough to be at the Airtel, and Airtel was the master consolidator at that time. At that time also, Airtel was innovative enough to have some of these complex mechanisms that you showed, Shishir, on the screen, to embed those on the deals that time. And fast forward today, and we spoke about in the previous panel about the CCPS. And just talking about a very simple transaction that we did in a minority, there was a hesitance, okay, that we should only be taking equity stake, as Pratibha mentioned. But with the advice of our lawyers, as you would say, we were able to convince the stakeholders that no, okay, equity plus CCPS is a better combination when you have to go and invest in startups. So the point I'm trying to say is VUCA is there, VUCA will be there, but the whole openness of the corporates to adopt us has increased over a period of time, and which is a good sign for the overall M&A industry as well as India.
Thanks, Disha. Nitin, one of the many roles you have is that of a company secretary. And I think the OG of regulatory ambiguity was MCA.
Right.
Long before we entered the VUCA environment, it was MCA that was churning out 10 circulars a month. It was all the sands of company law in India were always shifting. However, the ecosystem was such that the institute and its members always had access to the MCA. Correct. So on one end of the spectrum, there's the MCA. Maybe somewhere in the middle, you could say there's the RBI, which has access to authorized dealers, but not to the actual constituency. And then at the other end, you have the current FDI regime, where investors have zero access to the relevant government departments that's approving the FDI proposal. So on that spectrum, there are regulators that are very accessible, and there are regulators that have zero access. I want to bring you in. Do you feel this model of this model of dialogue between the regulator and the regulated mitigates VUCA in the context of M&A?
I think definitely it would mitigate to a large extent, because once there is an open dialogue between the regulated and the regulator, the regulated can also give their viewpoints much before a delegated legislation comes out or a rule comes out, and that viewpoint or business complexity is taken into consideration before the regulation is actually announced. Because if you don't consider the viewpoints of the regulated, there may be uncertainty, unpredictability, all that. And one of the key features of rule of law is, of course, predictability and certainty. I would say the regulators recently, for example, SEBI, as other speakers have also mentioned, have opened up. But I would say MCA still has to, cover a fair amount of pace on that. There are other regulators which have also opened up, because the general environment, I would say, in India has opened up to that extent. Because earlier, as Mr. Shroff mentioned, earlier it was about a relationship, but now it is about, there is a rule, you have to follow it. So maybe that is still opened up, but I would say still a lot more needs to be done, at least on that front.
That's an interesting point you make, Nitin. I think what I'm sensing is there's access in an ad hoc way, which is what we are used to in the MCA instance, and access in an institutionalized way where committee reports are put out, drafts are put out for comments, everyone weighs in, which is the SEBI model. Mr. Shroff, I'd like to bring you in to comment on because obviously I think you've seen this journey longer than anyone else in this panel. What do you think how much do you think this helps, this conversation between the regulator and the regulated, the mechanism in which that conversation happens to reduce the deleterious effects of VUCA on deal making?
So I would agree with him that it is helpful, but we have to look at it from the point of view of practical effectiveness. If you go with a genuine ambiguous structure and you are looking for an answer, there is still a bias towards no because of risk aversion. And also the regulator doesn't have enough trust in, there is a distrust between the state and the private citizen. What are you not telling me when you come to me? What do you really want to do? And that vicious circle has to be broken. So if my experience has been kind of mixed, that if you go with sort of a clean heart and you really express what you want, you're likely to get at least a clear answer, yes or no, whatever it is. If you're playing games with them and just trying to give selective information, you'll get an ambiguous answer, which again you'll spend a lot of time trying to interpret. The no action letters or pre-consult and others, they come in various shapes and sizes. And we see sometimes that in somebody else's case, where some pre-consult has been done and a no action letter has been, then it goes up on the website, and then it spoils the life for a lot of other people because it's been given on sort of inapplicable facts. So because that kind of, even though it is not law, it gets treated like law. So it's a double-edged weapon which you must use carefully. And of course, the trick that we all use is we go, if we like the answer, we formalize it. Otherwise, we quickly make a hasty retreat and go home.
And that's why I think the old dictum of law school, hard facts make for bad law. We're seeing that with the SEBI informal guidance.
Couple of transactions just now where we are confronted with a roadblock that has nothing to do with the law or case law. It is some random no action letter that has been given to somebody else.
Yeah.
So it reminds me of don't ask a question you don't know the answer.
Yes.
And sometimes, industry also needs to be fully transparent. We also try to hide things or, try to be over smart at times. And then it becomes a cat and mouse games, that.
Disha, you're obviously a part of and you've consistently been part of the MNC ecosystem. So you've, both in your own functions and presumably, you hear of other deals in your ecosystem. What do you think, how different do you think M&A is in developed markets? And then relative to other emerging countries, how much do you think this VUCA is an issue in India relative to other emerging countries?
Thanks, Shishir. That's a very intriguing question, right? As I reflect on it, there's a small analogy which is coming to my mind. If you allow, I may share with you. I have a young daughter. She's 7 years old, right? And we have a very set routine for her, right? What is she going to do in every 30 minutes? The right time she comes to school and before she hits the bed.
A very good daughter.
Yeah, thanks. And this routine is not a stable routine, okay? I keep on changing after every 3 months or 6 months. And compared to me, this is in late 30s, a working professional, pretty much the similar routine, going back home, working, and then, get ready for the same routine next day. She at times compares and complains why my routine is changing every day, right? And versus you have a pretty stable routine. And that's where I tell her it is for the right reason. For the stage you are in, you cannot afford to have a stable regime, right? Now coming back to your question, Shishir, which was how stable are these regimes in India versus developed markets. So I think it's not even fair to compare India or any developing market with a developed market. We are talking about India, who is actually world's fastest growing economy, right? Who has the burden to actually grow the entire world, right? And versus those developed economies who are either in low single-digit growth or the growth has stagnated. And we are comparing, how our tax regime is going to fare with them. No, absolutely, we ought to evolve our tax regimes or the policies or any regulations and this whole adaptability of India to this innovative structures or new regimes, it's what's making India more attractive. Well, everyone has his own pain. Pratibha, the private investor, have their own pain in this adaptability. But as long as we as the corporates are able to adjust to this environment, it's actually incremental to the growth of India. So that's how I see the stability aspect. And let's just take a step back, right? Why do we have all this VUCA, this whole hype about VUCA? This Indian tax regime, right, it's actually deeply influenced by our annual budget announcements, right? Our budgets tell us, how much government is actually got the revenue for the last year and what is the expected expenditure for the next year. If there is a fiscal deficit, government has to make some adjustments and increase the tax rates. And if there is a scope in the expenditures, right, then they would reduce the tax slabs. So the stage at which Indian government is, where they have to adjust the tax slabs and increase or decrease their revenue kitty to maintain the social welfare also and to maintain the startup ecosystem also, this regimes will continue to evolve and will be volatile. And I think till the time we become the third largest economy in the world, we'll have to bear with this all VUCA. And yes, once we become the third largest economy, then we'll also proudly say that my tax regime is not going to change and the SEBI is not going to move, RBI said that. Till that time, this is a journey. All of us are in this journey and I think we are all growing with this journey. Thank you.
I'm gonna turn to Nitin, but before I do that, I completely understand the households.
I want to add to what you have said.
Sure.
And my experience is most of the private equity firms, particularly who are US-based private equity firms, they use the route of Mauritius and other countries to avoid, I should not use the word evade,
Yeah.
to avoid taxes in India with respect to the earning they have in India.
Right.
And when the government understand their structure, they try to
Exactly.
they try to do that.
Yeah.
Although I'm not in favor of retrospective changes.
Yeah.
And retrospective changes are also like, I think, one-off case, that is Vodafone case only,
Yes.
with respect to the taxation. And as Shroff sir said about the bond thing, that is done by the court and not by the policymakers as such.
Yes.
But it's not like it is on a daily basis retrospective amendments are being done. But from the tax point of view, I think although all the investor has a right to structure their deals, but primary objective of routing the money through the tax havens or other things are to avoid taxes in India.
Absolutely. I agree with you, Praveen. And on that build, I want to add one more aspect, right? Why do government actually have to do these kind of structures or actually implement these kind of limitations? Because ultimately, our objective is not to facilitate foreign investors come, earn money and take the money out. Our objective of the government is to make sure that the India as a country flourishes, and the whole aspect of we becoming from developing to become a developed market, not just investors come, take money and we still remain the poor country, right? And that is where this whole fear of governments are there, so that they PN3, we've been talking about PN3, and PN3 is a very classic example of why government had done this, because we don't want Chinese companies to come and acquire all the small companies and we become another developing market. So that's one. And second aspect, we have been talking about this retrospective. Now, current government in case is a very clear example how they are actually trying to reverse some of the decisions which were made by an earlier government, and they in 2021, our finance minister actually nullified that announcement. And it's a clear case how government is actually trying to make India the whole tax adverse environment which is there, how we can slowly and gradually remove it. It's not a overnight change, it's not going to happen for sure, but there is a movement towards that direction.
Yeah, just wanted to add, there has been a change in the tax slabs as well. In 2019, when the company which has been incorporated, there have been certain tax breaks.
Yeah. So, and that is exactly the point. As long as companies are coming here to build the country, to manufacture something, and it goes along with the Make in India overall strategy that the country has, you're more than welcome, and we're actually willing to give you the tax stops.
Another answer to why to Shishir's question is that at one level India is one country, but I often say that India is actually like Europe. It's a continent comprised of many countries, and not just in terms of the states as well, but it's actually many countries at different levels, both geographically and also in terms of its kind of economic strata. So we have 1.4 billion people, of which about 40 to 50 million are Europeans, roughly, in terms of their mindset and economic growth. Then we have another 30-40 million, which are basically Indonesians, roughly, and the rest are sub-Saharan Africa. This is India. And when any policymaker sits in Delhi or wherever, he or she is actually dealing with the whole country. So they have to devise a policy for Bharat. They have to devise one for India, and then they have to devise one for the uber rich. I mean, those 50 million Europeans at the top are super privileged. I mean, all of us sitting here are super privileged. We don't know really what the hardship that is faced over there. But when you put on your policymaker hat, you can't say, no, I'm only going to make policy for these Europeans. And what about the Indonesians? And what about those? And that when that conflict starts appearing in your mind is when all these things that we have been talking about today start appearing, which are counterintuitive to a Western mind. But when you understand India, you understand exactly why this is happening. Why is our PDP like this? Why is all the FDI regulations on e-commerce what they are? This is the reason. This is actually what happens when you switch on to the policy side. You start understanding these three Indias.
As a company also, I'm just diverting from the whole economy and the global perspective. We keep using a familiar term called WIMI, which is winning in many Indias. So at the corporate level also, we are not looking India at just one country level. We have actually, sliced it down to multiple India. and making a strategy. And this is not just us, like, all the other FMCG companies. So that is the kind of nuances, India brings it.
Somebody in Lever that told me this.
Yes.
Winning in Lever.
Yes. So these are the kind of nuances which corporates have to face, and as you rightly said.
Originally their design was basically 3 markets. Now there's some 50 odd Indias.
Totally. Yes.
There are 2 Indias right here, because I can tell you in my household also, we have very strict rules. My daughters have set very strict rules of what I will do every half an hour. Correct? So I've clearly realized now I'm the emerging market in my own house. I wouldn't have known that, Disha, if you hadn't.
Especially a working mother, I tell you.
I'm neither working nor a mother, but and then I do want to quickly bring you in, because this clearly seems to have touched a nationalist nerve here. So I want to bring you in. Where do you stand on this?
So if you see other countries, for example, US or Europe or Pacific region in Australia, where I also am responsible, I think there is similar complexity there as well. But the only difference which I see is sometimes in court decisions. For example, last year, if you remember, you had the Supreme Court decision on the double taxation, agreement that we have. For example, with Netherlands, we used to deduct TDS of 5%. The Supreme Court said now it's 10%. Millions of euros you had to again pay up, and who will bear that? So a certainty of application of law is very, very important. And I see that mainly in tax laws or exchange control issues. Corporate side, more or less it is certain. FDI, of course, there are some issues depending upon the structures and the companies involved. But tax is something that is highly complex. We just need to simplify it, make it more certain, because multinational companies really need predictability.
Yeah.
And that would then take away the shine from India.
So a lot of the work that we as a firm do are also for foreign private equity clients who are not represented on this panel. So let me maybe say this on their behalf. And there's a very simple answer. If you don't like your own treaty with Mauritius, fix that. Don't take capital and then get into a conversation about, you're doing this to avoid tax. The DTA with Mauritius is a part of your law. Nobody forced that treaty on you. That was part of the package we offer to our private equity clients when we invite capital. Similarly, I think they'd say, if you put the question to some of our private equity clients, they'd say, look, nomenclature doesn't make a difference. In the context of Vodafone, we said that was retrospective tax. But we know retrospective in India is a bad word. Otherwise, what's happening to the gaming companies is as much retrospective taxation and of a magnitude. The numbers involved there are 2-3 times the numbers involved in Vodafone. But in India, retrospective taxation has become such a bad word. So I think there's a lot to be said. We are dealing with very unique problems, and sometimes our governments are probably having to think on their feet. But yeah, so I think...
whenever we prepare for our board or audit committee risks, enterprise risk management, regulatory risks occupy a large time in discussions.
Disha and Mr. Shroff, one point I do want to bring, I think as lawyers, we've all seen different kinds of VUCA. Early on in the late 90s, early 2000s, FDI policy was just a very rudimentary, a basic law. For many years, people would quarrel about whether optionally convertible instruments are. You remember those days when optionally convertible instruments, are they equity, are they not equity? Right from there to today, where across the spectrum of legislation, there is this, far more sophisticated, but and yet far more sophisticated, and then that much more ambiguity, that much more volatility in the regulatory landscape. I want to bring you in, Mr. Shroff. Talk to us a little bit about how you've seen the kinds of VUCA change over the years.
That's a great question. It is linked to what you yourself said. As the instrument and the market has become more sophisticated, more transactions have happened, the political philosophy of the country has also changed from time to time. I think once at one level things have got simpler. At least clarifications have been given. But new sort of things. It's like that. There's a game where you sort of knock gopher in one hole and something like that. Whack-a-mole. It's a whack-a-mole. So there, when we're seeing that live on regulation. What was the political thinking in 91 when Manmohan Singh? Firstly, he was trying to dismantle a 50-year-old mindset. In terms of just opening up the market, and obviously with a degree of caution, because you can't go all. He couldn't have brought in the state of 2024 in 1991. So it was gradually, It was boiling the frog slowly, just started the fire at that stage. And as the world's confidence came up, we evolved. Basically, we evolved. So philosophically, I think it's the same type of VUCA, but different temperature levels. I think as well. I don't think they're new categories. Regulatory, ambiguity. I think the geopolitical angle. There was some suspicion of China even at that time. That continues today. Courts were courts then. Courts are courts today. You still have that. Anything can come from anywhere. I was talking to one of the foreign banker friends, and there was another Indian banker who was with me. We were talking of some VUCA type of thing. We took an example of a traffic signal. So in the West, when you're crossing the road, New York, for example, red means red, yellow means yellow, green means green. So it's you stop there, wait for, and then you cross the road. India में पहले क्या होता है कि whatever be the color of the light,
color blindness,
try to cross, you will cross the line, and then when you did that, you looked and saw कि नहीं गाड़ी नहीं आ रहा है, but suddenly some car will come which you never thought will come, and so this is what can happen in India. Firstly, partly it's your fault because you didn't see that red, green, yellow, and secondly that the car can come from anywhere. It can be a judicial car, it can be a regional car, it can be something from the state government, it can be from the tax department.
And the traffic lights may not work also.
Yes. गाड़ी तो बहुत लोग चलाते हैं, and some of them may be hiding in one corner on the side.
What has happened is Indian गाड़ियों का pickup था ही नहीं कभी इतना. In the last 3 years, suddenly this regulatory pickup has happened, so we don't know how to gauge the.
This is how we explain VUCA to the foreign banks.
Yes.
But even if you're green, then still somebody can come.
Yes.
Disha, I want to bring you in on this. In your own experience of 15 years,
Yeah.
I think obviously as an economy, we've seen massive acceleration, right? A lot of wealth has been created. Some would say a lot of inequality has also been created. Yeah.
That's in both the mother-daughter example as well, and we are a developing country, they can have the luxury of all this.
Sure.
But how do we compare against other emerging markets? Like you are operating in, say, an Indonesia or a Vietnam, or how do we fare against them?
So now this question will go into the other side of discussion because when we talk about the competition law, Anderson, we try to take the best practices from Europe, right? Because there are a lot of good things that we can copy. And when it comes to the emerging markets for Bangladesh and Nepal, they actually look up to us, right, to follow the law. So that is the beauty of India. You have developed to a certain extent that certain countries have started to look up to you, and you continue to look upwards, and which is the journey, right, which we go forward. So that's my answer to your question. And to Shishir's your question, I echo what Mr. Shroff has said. Nothing has changed per se. There is not like there was one VUCA issue 15 years back and there is a new VUCA issue, except like the PN3, which is a very recent addition. But of course, the China fears used to be there. Now it has more formalized with little more uncertainty, right? So those things have come up. But what has changed is, I would like to, on the cost of repetition, is the mindset of the corporates. We are much better prepared, what's coming ahead. And very beautiful example of the PVR Inox merger that we shared. And if a deal of this magnitude can be closed in a small amount of time, that shows the kind of preparedness corporates come when they have to execute a deal, right? And Reliance is also another example. They have also been managed to, close multiple transactions. So the idea is, as long as you are aware, and which is a good part, that we are aware what issues do exist in India and how can we, navigate through those challenges.
That's a great answer. Nitin, I want to bring you in on one aspect of it. Some would say that actually something distinct that has changed in the last 15 years is that earlier VUCA implications were isolated. If tax regime can change, it's tax regime that can change. If RBI is going to tinker with foreign exchange regulations, make certain kinds of capital account transactions more complicated, that's isolated. Now, some folks would say, certainly we hear this a lot, is that there is the interconnectedness amongst regulators. So if you have a certain ambiguous issue with the ED, the securities market regulator won't touch you, won't let you list, won't let you issue a new product. So there is a compounding, as it were. It's no longer linear. The growth of ambiguity and uncertainty in the regulatory regime, because of an unconnectedness of a kind of a degree that was unknown earlier. I'd like to bring you in. Do you sense this around do you see this?
Yeah, so because of this digital economy also, now information is easily accessible by everybody at a single touch of a button, right? Everything is digitized. So whether it is the ED, whether it's the CBI, whether it's the RBI, everybody has access to any amount of data that can be accessible. And I would say all these regulators in this present era work like an orchestra, and everybody is working in tandem. It's like a perfectly synchronized. And once you're caught in that,
The regulatory state.
Regulatory state. And once you correct, and once you're caught in that, it's difficult to come out of that orchestra. So our criminal justice system is also like this, right? Once you're in that system, it's like a well. You just go down and down, and it's difficult to come out.
And then there's another point.
Not just Indian, these regulators are cooperating a lot with
Global also,
Yeah.
correct, sir.
That's right. Nitin, one reason for regulatory flip-flops, we spoke about this in the earlier panel, how sometimes it's so blatant. Regulators can take a position and then 6 months later take another position. And sometimes they do it in published material. Imagine how much worse the problem is when it's not in the open, where it's on regulatory applications that are happening on closed doors. As lawyers, we think that part of the reason why this flip-flop goes unchecked is because there's no judicial oversight. And there isn't. You can't challenge. There's no credible, effective mechanism to challenge the position that SEBI takes on an application or an approval. And that in turn is because there's, at least as lawyers, we sense this, and you should keep us honest on this, that over the years, litigating against the government is no longer viewed as a realistic option with many clients. I want to bring you in, Nitin, and then Disha, you. I want you to comment on, is this a correct perception? What explains this?
I think this is a correct perception, because while any regulator's action is subject to judicial review, you can of course go to the High Court 226, you can go to the Supreme Court, they have wide powers. But from an MNC perspective, I would say nobody would like to challenge or be in a contentious position, because in deals you have, except probably tax, because there is a financial impact, large financial impact.
kind of less ego attached.
Correct.
Order area koi jayega.
Because agility in deals is very important. Plus, as an MNC, if you're seeing to be litigating against the government, this will also affect your reputation. Plus, this is not one deal. You'll also have to do many more deals. So if you are in a contentious position or accept tax probably, then you would also affect your reputation to do other deals where you have to deal with the government again.
Is this sort of, I'm going to use a word.
And also you have to see holistically whether that risk is large to that deal, or is it something which is small, which you can ignore and take it in the risk buffer, or should we move ahead? So you have to see the whole picture, whether you want to really go out with the regulator on that point, or whether you just want to ignore it and just move on.
So I'm going to use a word and I'm going to drill down. What I'm sensing is you're saying there's a kind of stigma attached to litigating with the state. Correct. Do you sense this with jurisdictions, other countries? Is this the way litigating with the state would be viewed?
I would say not in other countries. For example, because as you say, those countries are a little more in a different parameters, different scale, not very comparable, I would say.
Sure.
Because the certainties are much more there. Maybe litigation is less there, and people don't litigate. But in India, of course, it's slightly different.
Disha, what's been your experience?
Yeah, there's a difference between a regulated industry and financial services, almost unthinkable.
It's a big fish in your pond.
Industry, you're probably willing to take a few bucks.
Disha, what's been your experience on this?
Again, I like to bring it back to some simpler examples, because that's how my mind works, right? Your question is like, how about litigating the government or the regulator, right? My question to most of us is, if we are in a corporate sector, how many of us do fight with our bosses? Probably we won't like to, right? Because boss is always right, and it's better if you are looking for a very long-term career, you better not fight.
Mr. Shroff's face lit up.
So the thing is, we are in a kind of a setup, right, where there is a hierarchy, there is a democracy, and there is a respect for both. And I think if you go with the system, then the system will respect you as well. If you just want to litigate or fight, there is no answer to it. You will end up spending money, your time, your efforts, everything, and result definitely will not most likely will not be there. And as he said, if you are a long-term investor and a long-term play in India, it's better to find a other way to work around it rather than fighting it out. And then corporate lobbies, right? The industry bodies, they are meant for this purpose where you can go and actually say your viewpoint and make everyone at your side, and then government listens to you rather than you fighting your own battle.
It's a great point.
Government authorities are called government servants and not bosses. But your analogy is government is the boss and not the servant.
See,
You're talking about the power equation.
yes.
As it is versus as it should be.
This industry body
normally don't represent companies.
No, and they try to adjust to the lowest common denominator. They will never, if you have a specific problem, and unless there's a critical mass of people who have a similar problem, that won't work.
So I'm
industry-wise.
Yes.
And I was actually referring to a similar kind of a thing only now. Just to take an example, there has been a recent regulation in terms of the use of recycled PET from 2025 onwards. Now, government has become all of a sudden very motivated from the West, and they say that 30% of the PET that you're using in your bottles, it should be recycled PET. And they have not taken even a minute to realize that there is not enough supply of recycled PET in the market. And in a year or 2 year span, the capacity cannot be built like that. And that's where we are not going and fighting with the government, and neither we are saying that you should take it back. In fact, we are working with the other industry bodies who are also facing the same heat and then representing our case. So that's my humble submission. Of course, it depends on the case to case and the issue every corporate is facing.
I think, systemic issues need to be addressed. So if there is a systemic issue in, M&A transaction or a law or a regulation, I think with industry bodies, with similar minded people, we should work and in a long term try to change that, which I think FICCI and CII tried
So
to.
you've been on that corporate users. So on a call like that, even there's about 20 people, there are 20 different opinions.
Right.
So how do you find that common denominator which is worth...
So I think, sir, persuasion, probably, for example, the NFRA issue probably touched chords with everybody.
So there will be a set of common issues that will come.
Right.
But it is not, I wouldn't go as far as she said that you can agitate through an industry forum, because there you take the risk of being clubbed together with a lot of other people who don't have similar interests. But there will be moments in your sort of business journey where sometimes you will have to fight with the state, where the action is extreme.
For a telecom industry, and it goes back. So DOT, when DOT had laid out some very not so favorable views against the industry, and that's when all the telecom operators had come and it worked really. So there are cases where it has worked, and there are cases where we have to take some other views.
Times for war.
Absolutely.
Oh, Disha, we think that it didn't work in the DOT case though.
With your boss also, I think once you have a conviction about certain belief or certain position, I think we need to take that. At times, of course, you need to take a financial consideration also, but there may be situations where you need to take a stand.
Yeah.
Pick your battles, of course.
Sometimes you have to change the job as well.
Nitin and Disha, this has been such an interesting conversation. Thank you once again. It was lovely to have you guys.
For moderating. Thank you so much.